Good afternoon, one and all. Okay, so today's lesson then, what we're going to be doing is taking the knowledge that we had from last lesson, which was all about different hazards and weather hazards that we might find in the UK. And we're going to take it that a little bit further, and we're going to start to look at some examples of different weather hazards that have occurred in the United Kingdom. I say this time and time again, but remember, geography is a study of the real world. And if geography is a study of the real world, then we need to be able to give examples, and we need to be able to give up case studies to back up some of the things that we've been looking at. So we're going to be looking at an extreme weather event in the UK, and the case study example that we are going to use is of something that occurred in 2014, and we're going to be looking at an example of extreme weather on the Somerset Levels. So without further ado, I'm just going to present my screen to you guys just so that I can guide you through the slide deck and guide you through the work that we're going to be completing over the course of this particular lesson. Now remember, this is a real-time lesson, so I will explain all of the tasks to you as you go. Okay, but it bears in mind to say that you always have the ability to be able to stop, to be able to pause, to be able to rewind if you need to. So what we're going to look at today, and this is going to be the first of two lessons which we're going to spend on this, is we're going to look at the causes and we're going to look at the effects of some flooding which occurred in 2014 on the Somerset Levels. Now, for me, these two key words are critical. You've got the word cause, which is the reasons why it happened in the first place. You've got the effects, which are the negative things that happen as a consequence of that. There could be positive things as well. And then we've got our case study example, which is the Somerset Levels floods. Now, if we have a little look at our target question, which I'm just circling with my mouse cursor at the moment, it says that we need to be able to explain the social and economic effects of an extreme weather event in the UK. And this is a very similar sort of question to one that you could get asked in an exam. Now, I've gone through my process with you time and time again in the classroom of bugs, where we start off by boxing the command word, underlining the keywords that we think are important within the question, okay, going back and rewording the question, and then ultimately sequencing our answer. Now, towards the end of this lesson, I'm going to show you my model answer to this particular question, and you're going to use that model answer to be able to guide you through that process. So for me, the command word in here is explain. And if we're explaining, that means that we need to be able to give reasons why something happens. So what we need to do is give reasons for the social and economic effects of this extreme weather event. Now, if I were to underline, I'd underline social and I'd underline economic. So in other words, we're going to be looking at the effects on people, and we're also going to look at the effects in terms of the economy. So we're talking about the impacts on money. Now, we will also look at some of the environmental consequences as well, but it's worth bearing in mind that this question is not asking us for what those environmental effects are. It's only asking us for the social effects and the economic effects. Now, in terms of our success criteria, we need to be able to categorize our effects into social and economic. We need to be able to use connectives. So we're talking about therefore. This means that as a consequence of, in order to be able to give detailed explanations. And where possible, we need to give some specific case study examples. Okay, and I'm going to guide you through that as we go through this particular lesson. So the first thing that we need to think about really is, where is our case study? You've got a nice little map down there on the right hand side, which shows us where Somerset is located in the United Kingdom. So we're looking at the southwest corner here in this little red box, and we've got this area in particular which marks the Somerset Levels. So Somerset is a county in the southwest of England. The Somerset Levels and the Somerset Moors are an extensive area of low-lying farmland and wetlands, okay? And this is going to be really important when we start thinking about some of the possible impacts. A lot of this land is farmland, and I'll show you a picture of it a little bit later on. So flooding is something that's always happened on the Somerset Levels. It's been happening for centuries. However, because we're starting to develop more and more settlements and more towns, like the town of Bridgewater, which you can see here, which is pretty much in the middle of the Somerset Levels, we're starting to see more and more things that are at risk. So the more settlements and villages and towns we've got, the more farmland we've got, the bigger the likelihood that we're going to have some impacts and some knock-on effects from some of these different events. So there's going to be more elements of risk. Now, what I've done is I've broken that down, and I've broken it down into this nice little mind map here. And this is a really useful thing to do for revision. I've done this by using some symbol creators on the internet, but you can just do it on pieces of paper. And this is a useful revision tool. I can use this information that's in front of me to be able to tell me everything about where the Somerset Levels are located. So if I go round this particular mind map, I can see that the Somerset Levels are in the southwest of the United Kingdom. I can tell that the land is flat, and that it's predominantly farmland and wetland, okay? And that's what that symbol's reminding me. But I also know that there is more and more in the way of settlements which are starting to appear in this particular area, which means that the area is more at risk. Okay, so what I can do is I can guide myself around this mind map in order to say where the Somerset levels are and to give a bit of background information as to why it's at risk. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to get this 3-minute timer ticking up here in the top left-hand side. And what I would like you guys to do is I'd like you to spend 3 minutes just looking at this mind map that we've got in front of you. And I want you to spend those 3 minutes making sure that on your Google document that you've got, okay, a good idea of where the Somerset levels are. So your time's ticking. Without further ado, away you go. Okay then, guys. Right, absolutely fantastic stuff. So that gives us a bit of context behind it. We know now where the Somerset levels are. We've got a bit of background information about the flooding and how that flooding occurred. Just to give you an idea, we've just said that this area is relatively low lying, relatively flat, and you can see that from these two pictures that are up on your screen at the moment. We've also said that the area has got lots of agricultural farmland, okay, and actually if we look at both of these images we can see that evidence of lots and lots of open fields, and there'll be a range of different farming types here. There'll be some arable farming, there'll also be some livestock farming with some dairy farming and cows and things that are grazing on this land. This picture here is one which I've chosen very deliberately because you can see here just how the amount of settlements that we've got, so towns, are starting to encroach more on that natural environment. And if we've got more towns, as we said earlier, and if we've got more settlements, that means that we're increasing our likelihood and our chances of risk. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show you a little bit of a video clip. Now this video will pan over the Somerset levels. I'm not going to play all of it. It comes from Channel 4 News, but just to give you an idea of the extent of the flooding that occurred in 2014, let's just have a little look. So here you can see examples of the responses, and we'll look at those responses as we start to move through into our next lesson. Just look at the scale of the flooding, just look at how much land it's covering and how threatened each of these different settlements are that you can see on this video. Okay, right, I'll just pause that there, okay? Now, what we need to do is we need to look at the causes. In other words, why did this happen in the first place? So, I've already told you the date. We're flashing point to 2014. Now, 2014 was the wettest January on record since records began, and records began way back in 1901. So, essentially, what we're talking about here is a once in a century style flood. We're talking about once in 100 years. We had 350 millimeters of precipitation. Okay, now remember, when we're using keywords, we use keywords as much as possible. Precipitation, I'm talking about rainfall that fell between January and February. Now, that might not sound like much, but it's about 100 millimeters above the average for that time of year. Okay, now that on its own is a bit of a problem because the ground acts a little bit like a sponge. If over the course of 2 months it's continually raining, the ground becomes saturated. That means no more water can fit in it. And if no more water can fit in that ground, the water's got to go somewhere. And lo and behold, that quite often leads to lots and lots of flooding. Now, that was combined with lots of other factors. And we also needed to take into account that we had high tides. So you had high tides on the coast at the Bristol Channel and huge storm surges. And what happened was those storm surges pushed the water up the river, meaning that the fresh water moving down the river had nowhere to go as it met that storm surge. So it just spilled over the river and it flooded the riverbanks. And a lot of criticism went to the Environment Agency, and the criticism was that this particular river or these particular rivers had not been dredged for over 20 years. Now, what dredging is it's where you dig out all the sand and the silt and the sediment from the bottom of the river. So therefore, you ultimately alter the capacity of the river. So if you dredge a river, you can fit more water in it. And because there was all that sediment and silt which had built up on the bottom of the river, that lowered the capacity of the river. So it could carry less water. It had a lower discharge, which meant that you were more likely to get flooding. Okay, what I've done then is exactly the same as before when we gave the context. I've split my causes up into these symbols, which you can see on the screen. So the first one here has got the date. Okay, just to remind me that it was the wettest January and February on record since 1901. That we've got 300, it should say 350 really, shouldn't it? So 300 plus millimeters of precipitation, combining with a huge storm surge at the Bristol Channel and being combined with the fact that it had not been dredged for 20 years. Now, this is where specific information comes into your responses and answers and why it's so important to have some examples, because anyone can say that the rivers flooded because there was lots of rainfall. If you can tell me that it flooded because it was the wettest January and February on record since 1901, and that 350 millimeters of rainfall fell within that period, and it was combined with a storm surge up the Bristol Channel, and the fact that the rivers hadn't been dredged for 20 years, then you're showcasing your geographical knowledge. So what I'm going to do now then is exactly the same as before. I am going to pop that timer on, which is going to go for 3 minutes. What I'd like you guys to do is to use that 3 minutes to get down for me on your Google document your causes of this particular of this particular flood. Let's have a go. Okay, right, superb stuff then, guys. So what we've got then is we've got the information down that we need in terms of what the causes are. What we need to do now is we need to start moving on to the effects. So I'm going to show you another video clip, which is just going to give us an idea as to how people are impacted by some of these floods that occurred from this extreme weather event.
In January 2014, after weeks of intensive rain, floodwaters in Somerset reached record levels, and that meant it affected houses that had previously been safe from flooding. Among them, Bryony Sadler's house at Northmoor.
Where we're standing now, you would have been up to your thighs in water. Throughout the whole of the property, there was 2 foot of water in the house. But for 3 weeks, you know, just to even be able to come home and pick up a clean pair of pants, you know, you had to wear waders because you were literally pushing up to your, you know, thighs in water to, get to your home.
Because they could see the water coming days before it arrived, Bryony and her family were able to get most of their possessions upstairs. But when the flood came, it still wrecked the kitchen, damaged carpets and floor coverings, warped wooden doors and skirtings, and even saturated the brickwork and plaster, all of which had to be replaced. 165 homes were affected, and the total cost of damage to properties estimated at £16 million. And being flooded also has financial impacts in other ways.
We've had one house sale in the village, and they got about 2/3 of the price of what it should have been, which actually at the time was a really good price. We had our house valued about the September before we left in the January, and it was up for, I don't know, somewhere in the region of 650,000. I'm not sure we'd get anything more than about 450,000 now, if anybody would be interested in it at all.
The floods have also pushed up insurance premiums, and new buyers could find it difficult to get insurance at all. But the impacts of the flood weren't just economic. Whilst their homes were underwater and being repaired, hundreds of people had to find alternative accommodation for several months, disrupting schooling, work, and personal lives. Although Bryony managed to move her animals to safety, the floodwaters took weeks to recede, and that meant they also had a significant impact on local wildlife.
Before we left, we'd see, you know, barn owls floating in the water because they've got nothing to eat, and snakes that would try and swim away from all the flood water, but they'd just drown because they'd just be so exhausted.
18 months after the flood, Bryony's house might look like it's back to normal, but the building works are still ongoing.
The woodwork's cracking.
Oh, I see, yeah.
That's where I was going. You can see there. And the skirting's coming off. These are really good.
But some of the effects will take even longer to shake off. Ask almost anyone who's experienced a catastrophe like this, and they'll tell you the worst impacts are the emotional and psychological ones.
6 months on now, the thing that I find the hardest is your mental state. Your people's mental state is so massively affected, and I think probably will be for, I don't know yet. I can't put a time limit on it, but you know, you can't take in everyday life and everybody else's day-to-day problems. You know, you're still, because we've been through so much, it still really affects you.
Okay, right. So what we can see in that video is a whole range of different impacts. Starts off there with some of the social impacts. So you can see how her life has been affected, and you can see that it's impacted upon everything that they do on a day-to-day basis. We've also got some economic impacts there, because you can see that her home and her property has been destroyed, and that would have been the same for lots and lots of people up and down in each of these different villages and towns across the Somerset Levels. Now, in addition to that, there are knock-on effects. So she was talking about house prices. Well, if your place is flooded, people are less likely to buy it because they don't want their house to flood going forward into the future. And actually, the knock-on effect of that means that her house price is much lower. Insurance premiums go much higher. Insurance companies have to pay out, and there's a big economic effect of that. They estimated it there at 16 million. depending on what resource you look at will depend on what the figure is that's put on it, but you can see that there's a massive range of impacts. She also talks there a bit about some of the environmental impacts as well. So what I've got here is a table which basically splits out some key impacts into social, economic and environmental, okay? I'm going to read you through them. Your job is going to be to pause it when I tell you to pause it and to make sure that you've got the information down about each of these different impacts and each of these different effects. Now, the critical thing is I've decided to highlight some things that I think are specific pieces of information. So remember, if you look at it from an exam perspective, we always need to include information which is specific to our exam board, or sorry, specific to our example, to be able to show off our knowledge of a real location in a real place. So 600 houses, just like that lady's, have been destroyed. 16 farms had to be evacuated. Okay, and when we talk about evacuating farms, we're not just talking about evacuating it from people. If we look down here on the economic side of things, you've got over 1,000 livestock. So we're talking about cattle and cows that had to be evacuated as well. You've got local residents being moved into temporary accommodation for several months, and that actually links into some of the responses which we'll look at next lesson. You've got villages such as Moorland, and I've put that in bold for you because that's an example of a real place which is cut off, which affects people's day-to-day lives, such as attending school, going shopping, and because of that, many people had their power supplies cut off. Somerset County Council, in terms of the economic effects, impact said that it would cost about 10 million to be able to clear up, slightly lower than the estimate on that video, but still quite high. You've got 14,000 hectares of agricultural land underwater for 3 or 4 weeks. Now, if we're going to use connectives to be able to explain, well, therefore, that has a massive impact upon farmers' incomes, which then means that they've got impact upon the social side of things for their livelihood and their lives. And you've also got local roads being cut off, okay? So you've got local roads and railways being cut off, such as the Bristol to Taunton railway line, which was closed at Bridgewater, okay? Environmentally, the floodwater's contaminated with sewage and other chemicals go into the river. That's going to be bad for biodiversity. It's going to be bad for the ecosystem. Huge amounts of debris had to be cleared, and stagnant water that had been collected for months had to be re-oxygenated before being pumped back into the river, because if you'd have just pumped that stagnant water back into the river, there wouldn't have been enough oxygen in the water. And if there's not enough oxygen in the water, that can impact all sorts of life, including fish life that you might have within it. Now, critically, what I've done is I've put these things here in bold and in red that I think are the specific pieces of information which we're going to link into our 6-mark question, which I guided you through at the start of the lesson. So 600 houses. Don't just go into an exam and say homes were destroyed. Tell me how many homes were destroyed. Give me the name of a village that's been impacted, Moorland, for example. Tell me, not just that railway lines had to close. Quote the Bristol to Taunton railway line. Tell me how many hectares of agricultural land were underwater. Now, you probably wouldn't have to remember all of this, but that's really useful in being able to pick out those key pieces of information to be able to apply it within an exam. So what I'd like you to do now, before we tackle our exam question, is to just push pause on this video and make sure that in your Google document, you've got a table which has got the social effects, the economic effects, and the environmental effects. Away you go. Okay, we're at the stage now where we can look at the causes and the effects on the Somerset levels. We've categorized them into social, economic, and environmental. Let's look at our target question to explain the social and economic impacts or effects of an extreme weather event in the UK. Now I'm going to show you my model answer. I'm going to show you my model answer because you need to know what it is that you're aiming for. I'm going to read it through, and I'm going to highlight some things on it on my screen. So it says, the UK can be affected by a range of extreme weather events. 2014 was the wettest January since records began in 1901. This caused extensive flooding on the Somerset Levels. Because of this, there were social impacts such as villages like Moorland being cut off. As a consequence of this, many people could not go about their daily lives, such as go to school. There were other ways in which lives were disrupted, such as 600 homes being flooded. This led to a range of economic impacts. Somerset County Council estimated £10 million worth of damage, including essential repairs to the Bristol to Taunton railway line at Bridgewater. Okay, that's my model answer to the question. Now, I'm not saying that this answer is perfect, but it's a pretty good answer, and it would get us quite a few marks if we were to look at it in an exam. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this sentence here. And I'm going to highlight this sentence here because what I've done is I have set out my case study example. I've said in 2014, the wettest January record occurred and caused extensive flooding to the Somerset level. Okay, And it's really important that you give examples as much as you possibly can. And I've highlighted exactly where I've given those examples. Now, the question asked me for both the social impacts and also the economic impacts. So I'm going to highlight there where I've started talking about the social impacts. And I'm going to start to highlight down here where I've included some of the economic impacts, because if I'm not including both social and economic, I'm limiting the amount of marks that I can get. Now, I've also given a load of specific pieces of information. So 600 homes were flooded. Let's highlight that in another colour to be able to show those specific pieces of information. £10 million worth of damage. Again, another specific piece of information. Okay, I've got the village of Moorland, another specific piece of information which shows off my knowledge. And the Bristol to Taunton railway line, another specific piece of information. Now, in addition to this, I've used connectives to be able to explain. So as a consequence of is an example of a connective to be able to add that little bit more detail. So if we read the sentence back, it says, because of this, there were social impacts such as villages like Moorland being cut off. As a consequence of this, many people couldn't go about their daily lives. So I've used that connective to be able to explain in a bit more detail. Another connective down here, this led to a range of economic impacts. Okay, so you can see there that my answer has given both the social and the economic effects. It's given specific pieces of information highlighted here in orange, and it's also given some of those really, really important connectives to be able to explain in depth and in detail. So what I'd ask you guys to do now then is to have a go at the question. I'm going to pop a countdown timer on this time, and the countdown timer is going to go for 6 minutes because that's probably the equivalent time that you would have in an exam. If you need to, go back now, have another look at the question, reread my model answer, and pause it if you need to, but try and do it without looking directly at my model answer within your response. Okay, away you go. Okay then, guys. Right, well done. And that brings us to the end of today's online lesson. Hopefully you've got a good idea of the causes, the effects, and the Somerset levels. Video coming soon to look at some of the responses and to put that into the context of an exam question. Thank you very much, one and all. Yeah, keep working hard, and we'll see you soon.